Okay, let's begin with an introduction of our panelists. Today's panel, we have Andrew Gottesman, Chief Executive Officer of Gottesman Real Estate Partners, Hala Jomajuni, Director of Development at ISR at University of Michigan, Sherrie Kossoudji, Associate Professor, School of Social Work at the University of Michigan, and ICPSR Director, Margaret Levenstein. Welcome to our panelists. So we have a little bit of storytelling, exciting storytelling for this wonderful data set that's available. And so I will start the first question will be for Sherrie. The collection, curation, and sharing of these data, and we're talking about the new immigrants admitted to the United States, federal fiscal years 1972 to 2000. So they have a really unique story, as you're going to hear. Dr. Kossoudji, you had access to these data. Why did you believe it was important to gather the data together, curate and share the data, and what is unique about them?
Well, like many data experiences that I and others share, I found these data in 2011 while I was on the ICPSR website looking for something else. The INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, made individual fiscal year data on all admitted immigrants available. I just sort of ran into these fiscal year data sets on the ICPSR website. I aggregated all of those individual years of data from 1972 to 2000 into a single data set, and I worked to make all of the information consistent across all of those years. Even though the data from 1972 to 2000, the information in the data set is rarely seen, and the current curated data set gives researchers a guide to working on both current and past immigration issues. These data really represent a gold mine for immigration researchers. Better ways to record and archive immigration history are critical to our understanding. Yet too few people understand the absolutely arcane and complicated paths of the immigrant experience or immigration policy in order to successfully create data sets recording that experience. Imagine trying to create a data set right now as we have watched immigration policy change rapidly over the past couple of years. I gave a seminar a couple of years ago saying that the information I was speaking on was valid for at least that day, but I wasn't absolutely sure if it would be valid tomorrow. Here's what's critical. Many immigration researchers use census data for research on immigration because it's convenient. And what's unknown is that immigrants come on many different visas. And the census data set, we simply have information on all foreign-born, okay? Foreign-born people are people who were not US citizens at birth. So think about it. You're doing work on immigration. Researchers and spouses of US fiancés have very different immediate opportunities in the United States and very different long-term outcomes and impacts. But census research does not distinguish between these two groups of people. Let me just quickly say a couple of things about the data to whet people's appetites for later on. First, they are near population data on all immigrants to the United States between fiscal year 1972 and 2000. Second, many people do not realize that most immigrants admitted to the United States are actually already here. They come on other visas, and then maybe they're a worker, maybe they're a student, they change status and become an admitted immigrant. These data contain information on new immigrants' original arrival experiences, allowing researchers to investigate the paths of the immigration process. And third, and what excited me, is that the Immigration and Naturalization Service created data books of tables for their annual reporting to the government that use these data and similar data sets on non-immigrants, on refugees, and so forth. And these data can be matched with the tables to create an exciting new investigation. And I'll talk about that later. Finally, I'm so appreciative to Andy for helping us create this data set for ICPSR. I hope you understand that folks like me think that it's really, really important. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherrie. That's a good segue into how Andy got involved in this data philanthropy and activism. So I understand that you had a few projects to choose from, and you picked this one from ICPSR. Tell us more about what inspired you to help ICPSR curate these data and bring them to the community.
Sure, thank you. I should also, I guess, note that I'm an alum of the university because that's going to play into the story a little bit. I'm a 1992 graduate of the School of Literature, Science, and the Arts. I've always been involved in immigration issues. I grew up in a family business that had many, many immigrants as employees. And as I've figured out sort of family philanthropy and efforts to do good work in the world, it's often come back to immigrant issues. And 4 or 5 years ago, I think I first approached Michigan's development officer in New York City and told him about this interest. And he kept his eye open for various opportunities to give money to the university to back immigration studies. And he came back with 3 or 4 possibilities. And some of them were what I sort of expected in terms of resources for professors or for study materials and things like that. But I had never really thought about ISR at all. In fact, my only involvement with ISR as a student had been when I was a guinea pig for a psychology project, which back then you had to spend a year subjecting yourself to graduate students doing psych projects. And I did that. That was my only time in the building. And I learned to stay far away from that building after that. But when Pedro came back with an opportunity to give money for a project related to immigration, that really piqued my interest because it was different. And because it seemed like the kind of thing that a lot of other funders wouldn't be interested in, and it would be hard for them to raise money for. And so I was really kind of inspired by the work that Dr. Kossoudji had done, and also by the idea that there was sort of this data set, which I sort of imagined in my mind to be a bunch of old ledgers kind of sitting under a dusty rug in somebody's basement. And the need to have those be preserved for future researchers and policymakers. And so I sort of settled on that one, Dory, as kind of the most interesting.
Thank you for that great backstory. Next question I'm going to ask to Maggie. So you were able to help ICPSR find additional resources to come together and release these data. Can you tell us a story from the ICPSR perspective?
Well, so it's just a great story. Sherrie and I have known each other for a long time, and I think and we had talked about these data for a long time because she had worked hard to organize these data and clean these data up and to get more data out of INS. And that's what a lot of faculty do, right? That's what social science researchers do, is they try and find and create and make the best data available. And it's a lot of work, and people use it for their research. And then, like Sherrie, I think I can say this, Sherrie, they're getting ready toward the end of their academic career, their scholarly career, and they have these wonderful resources, and they want to make sure they know that they're valuable, and they want to make sure that they keep being available to the research community. So Sherrie had sort of thought about this, and we had talked about this over the years. And then, so when I got the email from Hala asking if they were, it went to all the center directors at the Institute for Social Research, and I'm one of 5, and saying what projects did we have going on with immigration. I thought of these data, and I thought this is a perfect, what we call data rescue project, where there's data which exists. It wasn't quite dusty ledgers, but it was soon to become inaccessible to the world, right? And we needed to reach out to Sherrie while she was still willing to spend her time. She has 2 grandchildren now. We're trying to get her to spend her time, talking to ICPSR and paying attention to these data, and make them available. And we know this is so important when we have resources like this to allow for students and future researchers to do this. So I wrote this up, and I said to Hala, I don't know if this is, what your donor is looking for, but this is one of these gifts that it's not quite an endowment gift, but when you create a data set that is preserved, ICPSR is a preservation archive. We're going to preserve the data. We're going to make it available to researchers, and it will keep generating more research and more improvements in data in the years to come. So I sent it off to Hala and said, I hope this is of interest. And Andy said it was. It gave us the opportunity to bring in another student from the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts, who came and spent a little more time than Andy apparently did at ISR, and he spent a lot of time going through Sherrie's data and organizing, cleaning it up, and making it accessible to third-party researchers. And then our professional curators took it from there and processed it further, so that a researcher, whether it's a student or a faculty member or somebody who's involved in immigration policy, comes and looks at these data, they can use them without having to send an email to Sherrie saying, what is column H, right? That's what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to make these data available to the community in a way that is really transparent, and that facilitates further analysis. So this was ICPSR. We love data rescue stories because we love data, and this was a great opportunity for us to bring together someone who had created a data resource with someone who cared about the subject of that data to create something for the community going forward.
Thank you so much, Maggie. This is a good segue into Hala. So as Director of Development at the Institute for Social Research, you're often in the role of bringing individuals together to accomplish great things like this. Why did this data story have a happy ending or a happy beginning?
Thank you, Dory. What an honor to participate in this conversation today. I first just want to say that it's truly an honor to also be to serve as the Director of Development for the Institute for Social Research, a world leader in social science research and data. The story of Andy's gift to ICPSR was kind of like seeing magic happen. It was my first gift that I closed at ISR when I joined the ISR community, and so I'll forever remember this gift in a really meaningful way. And as you heard, Andy is very passionate about immigration and is also passionate about supporting his alma mater. What's really fun about working with donors is that oftentimes they're deeply passionate about something and they want to make a difference. And I get to work with them alongside our faculty leaders who are also deeply passionate about their area of expertise and also want to make a difference in the world. And so in this case, I got to bridge both of those together, and it was just really fun. Something that's kind of challenging and also rewarding about working in the development space is kind of this idea of taking really kind of, for lack of a better word, dry information and turning it into something that donors can get really excited about. And that, I think, was really a fun opportunity for me to work with Andy and to work with Sherrie and Maggie and the whole group on this project of taking kind of data and making the case that it was going to be really important for the world. So really what I find is I often am asking things like why questions of our researchers in order to understand kind of the impact that the philanthropy can have. So the happy ending here is that these data are not lost. So as Maggie suggested, this is a data rescue effort that Andy has funded, and we will forever be grateful to Andy for making these data available through his philanthropy. And I think the true happy ending, like the end of the happy ending, will be when these data can be used in a meaningful way by people who are out there working to change the world through policy or in other ways. So thank you to Andy for supporting this work. And our hope is that Andy's story will inspire others to support such rescue efforts in the future. So please feel free to contact me if anyone has questions about how this all works, and I'd be happy to hear from you. Again, thank you to Andy for making this possible.
Thank you, Hala. So now I just want to stop and see if any of the panelists want to add anything. We're doing great on time. And then after this, we can turn to questions.
I guess I'd add just one other thing too that I've sort of forgotten about the importance of to me, which is giving a student on campus the opportunity to work. And that's really what the money went towards, was somebody's time to crunch data, to build software that was necessary to read it and use it functionally. And I always like projects where students can get an opportunity to do real world kinds of things and get paid for it at university to help their, it helps their loan burden or their tuition burden or whatever it might be. And with something like this, I never met the person who did it, but I would hope that it's on her or his resume. I mean, it was a real project to do this, and it's a skill that would be valuable in the real world. And funding that kind of opportunity is really as important as the data itself in some respects.
Thank you. Anything else from the panelists? Okay, I think we're good. So we do have, please type in your questions. I can see one that came in through chat. And the question is, when you say new immigrants admitted, how is admitted operationalized? Does it mean entry on US soil, or does it mean obtaining permanent status? Oh, Sherrie, you're muted. No problem.
That's what's really important about these data and about understanding how immigration works. Whenever you see new immigrants admitted, what you are seeing is that people who were newly admitted as immigrants, not people who first come to the United States, but people who are have newly achieved immigration as an immigrant status. And that's, like I said before, that's what's important about these data, because we know who was here before and how they got here before they became an immigrant. We'll talk a little bit about that later.
You're now muted, Dory.
Trying to get my mouse to behave. Thanks, Maggie. What can someone do if they know of other opportunities like this one to bring other data to the community?
Call us, email us. We have a great acquisitions team. But if you just email ICPSR, somebody from our acquisitions team will reach out to you and talk to you. Actually, I was saying to Hala earlier that there's actually a whole generation of faculty, those baby boomer faculty who have collected really valuable data, and we want to make sure that it survives. So contact us. I mean, the challenge is, depending on the state of the data, sometimes it takes resources to get it into a shape that somebody else can use it effectively. And our acquisitions team is really good at looking at the data that you have and giving, maybe giving a faculty member or a student, or in some cases we've seen a surviving spouse, go through data and clean it up and send it to us. And then we often will have students come in and work with it, especially if it needs some of the kind of harmonization that we like to see do that. And then again, we have professional curators who will add it to the social sciences variables database and create standardized documentation and standardized metadata so that it's useful to and easily preserved by other researchers. But I would say the first step is to contact us.
Thank you. I'm just scanning for more questions. We had a follow-up of someone still not clear on the term newly admitted. So do we want to talk about that some more?
So actually, Sherrie, a couple times you said you were going to talk about something in the future. Why don't you talk about that now? Because I think people having more of a sense of how what's in these data will be helpful, right, and might actually address this.
Right. I think that what a lot of people don't understand is that when we talk about new immigrants to the United States, that's our casual term that we use. When what used to be the Immigration and Naturalization Service and has now been taken over by Homeland Security, when they talk about newly admitted immigrants to the United States, they are using a technical term. What they mean is that these are people who have been newly admitted as immigrants. They have a green card, or which is now white or blue or some other color, but it's still called a green card. That means that they have the right to become a permanent resident of the United States. So if I become a permanent resident of the United States today, I'm a newly admitted immigrant in what year is this? 2020. But I might have come to the United States as a student on a student immigrant. So I might have actually come to the United States 2, 3, 5, 10 years ago. But I am a new immigrant right now. So I hope that helps people understand when the government uses the term newly admitted immigrant, it's a very specific term. That means someone who has just been admitted as an immigrant and has the right to stay in the United States for the rest of their lives.
Thank you.
So can I just add one other thing? Because I think, the question was in response to the question about immigration, but I think that this highlights something which is generally true, and that is increasingly researchers use administrative data for research. And the administrative data is as opposed to say survey data. So if the census does a survey, we have a list of questions and we have the answers. And if you want to know what the answer means, you look at the question. If you want to know what administrative data mean, you have to know something about the policy. So if you want to know what a new immigrant is, you have to know that's the term the government uses for people who've just received a green card, which I have to say I didn't know until Sherrie just said that. If you want to know what if somebody is poor when you're talking about schools, it probably means that they're eligible for a free or reduced lunch, right? That's actually, if you look at the research, that's what that means. And that could vary by state, it could vary over time. So increasingly researchers are using these kind of data, but it's really important to have them curated and processed in a way that makes those definitions visible, transparent to the user, because otherwise when people go to use the data, they can do things that are just that don't make any sense because they don't understand what we think of as the data generation process. The data generation process is not an experiment, it's not a survey, it is taking administrative data which is collected for some other purpose and analyzing it to understand the social process. And that requires understanding the policies that generate the process. And we actually systematically take those policies and put them into the data documentation so that researchers use them appropriately.
Thank you, Maggie. The next comment, I love the term data rescue. What was one challenge of missing data from a data set that spans such a large amount of time, and how do you approach that challenge?
I'll speak a little bit to this. These are government administrative data. So for many variables, there are no missing data because these come typically from the visa application to the government. And if there were missing data, their visa would be denied. And so for a lot of this information, there's no such thing as missing data. I'll talk again later on because the problem, as we've all been discussing so far, policies change, categories change, measurement changes. And so over this period of time, visa categories changed. In early years, refugees and asylees were a single group of people because we didn't even have a formal definition of a refugee because we didn't have the Refugee Act of 1980 yet. And all of that had to be worked with to try to come up with as consistent of data as we could possibly come up with. That's what took me personally years.
Thank you, Sherrie. Why is this project donor funded as opposed to grant funded? Is this a funding model that's becoming more prevalent or more necessary over time? Who wants to take
I don't know whether Hala wanted to answer that, but I would say I think it is partly that ISR has always been funded by grants. That's kind of our tradition. And it really is, since Hala came to ISR, we had a director of development before, but I think Hala has really helped to connect potential donors who see the value in things that we're doing at ISR with different projects at ISR. And we're really grateful because it's actually really important that we have different sources of funding because you find things that that don't match up with a particular federal funding mechanism, or it's just something which it gives people an opportunity who have a passion, have an interest to engage with those projects and shape them, and so we're really happy to have this sort of as another option for projects that need that kind of support. And this is I know there are other projects that Hala's been working on with ICPSR. Some of them are about data resources. So we have a donor that's supporting our archive for civic education data and civic participation. And we also have donors who support participation in our summer program in quantitative methods, especially our diversity, our efforts to diversify scholars who are using quantitative methods in the social sciences and providing that training. So I don't know, Hala, if you want to add more, but I think it's a great opportunity for us to engage with people who care about the kinds of research that we do and the kind of projects we undertake at ICPSR and ISR, who might not otherwise even know about them.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'll thank you, Maggie, for that. I would also add that, and Andy, feel free to chime in on this as well. When Andy was making this gift, one of his key questions was, why aren't grant funding agencies supporting this important work? And we had quite a few discussions about internally within ISR about whether there were funding vehicles that would be appropriate for this project. And what was established is that there were no opportunities that we saw at that time. And so really private philanthropy was going to be the only way to make this happen. So that really kind of is the direct and clear answer from my perspective. And then Maggie, I don't know if you want to add on to that, but I do know that was a question that Andy had for us too. Yeah. Like why fund it privately if this can be funded by a grant funding agency?
So most federal grants, if they fund preservation and data curation and sort of access to data. It's for data that they've created themselves. So we have a criminal justice archive. The Bureau of Justice Statistics does a bunch of surveys every year, and they send those surveys to us, and they fund our curation and dissemination of those data. And that's a model that federal agencies understand, that if they invest in creating a data resource that they think of as a research resource, and that's generally surveys, then they understand that it's important to preserve them and make them available. But for something like this, which is administrative data, the agency that's that creates it and produced it and made it available to the public isn't even sure they want anybody to look at it. And even though those agencies that do produce annual reports, and they might be happy to have them be away, they tend to think, oh, well, the only thing anybody's ever interested in is this year's report. And so they put something up on the web, and then the next year they take that down and they put the new thing up on the web. And the idea that it's useful for scientific purposes to save those data and have them and be able to look at them over time is just something which agencies that aren't charged with research per se just don't think about, and they don't fund it. They don't even, it's not part of how they think about it. And again, as people use more and more administrative data, these other kinds of things, there's more data that just gets lost.
Can I ask Sherrie sorry, I'm going to jump in here, Dory.
Go for it.
Can I ask Sherrie to talk a little bit about how these data were really not accessible when kind of going through the process and all of that? Sherrie, I think you know what I'm getting at.
First, these data are absolutely huge. So the data set that I put together of all those years has almost 20 million people in it. The individual data sets themselves are also huge. So there's between 1 and 2 million around there in each year's data set. And I think the thing that's hopefully is coming out of all this is that there's so few people who understand the arcane and legal ways that data like this are put together, that it took someone who's stupid like me, in the sense of I'm a real data geek and I was convinced that I could do it, to try to see what would happen if I got together all of the people who were admitted as immigrants between 1972 and 2000 and made all of their information consistent across all those years. I can't say I was completely successful at that, but imagine trying to go to a funder, right, a granting agency, and trying to explain how difficult it was to put all these data pieces together. They have enough on their minds, and I think the typical response would have been, but the individual fiscal years are right there on the ICPSR website. Somebody could just go through them and add them all together. Well, yeah, but it took me, what, Maggie, 3, 4, 5 years to do that? Only Andy was willing to help.
And so,
Probably even pretty small for a grant too. I mean, Hala could have spent a lot of hours going after the grant.
Yeah.
My gift was a nice gift, but this was not $1 million gift by any means. And so I would rather, as a donor, I'd rather see Hala be spending her time going after, serious big bucks from institutional funders who are soliciting grant proposals than kind of romancing one-off funders like me, who really should be in the business of making her job easier, not harder.
Thank you for that, Andy. I appreciate it.
Thank you. We have a few more questions, and that'll probably take us right up until time. There are two questions that are related to ICE. So are these folks that are ICE involved / registered with the government, with some with status and some without?
Again, this is one of the ways that people are really not familiar with immigration. ICE did not exist until 2003. And so, no, none of these people are ICE involved. There's no information about detention, deportation, etc. There was enforcement back then, but that was a very different experience. And those data on enforcement were never made available to the public. What is in this data set is there are some people who were back then called EWIs, entered without inspection, who eventually became immigrants. The starting point of these data is admitted as an immigrant. So the data set consists of all immigrants, but some of those people did not start out in the United States as immigrants. I forget whether there may be more to that question.
So Sherrie, when you see people in these data, if they're admitted as immigrants, can you see what proportion of them, say, started out as EWIs versus what proportion started out as students?
Of course, of course.
That's obvious to you.
Yeah, yeah. The one thing that is, I was going to talk about this later, but I don't think there's going to be a later now. So we'll figure out a way for us to get my information about the data set to the participants. I completely forgot what I was going to say.
That's okay.
It's all right. That's why, it's because we're rushing at the end. You'll send it, and we'll
send it.
We're gonna share the whole video with people. So
there's a good follow-up to your last point, Sherrie, talking about what the newly admitted immigrant status was before being newly admitted. For instance, that they had a student visa or tourist visa or were maybe undocumented.
Okay. Yes, and this is the part of the webinar where I would have later on explained carefully about the data. Let me just quickly say, because I know we're not going to have very much time, that the basic information comes for when these people are as newly admitted immigrants. What visa did they enter on as an immigrant? What is their country of nationality? What is their age, their gender, their marital status? A bunch of information that applies to them as a newly admitted immigrant. And the time period is consistent with the time of admission as an immigrant. But as I mentioned earlier, lots of people did not arrive on US soil as immigrants. So there's information, you could think of it this way, did you arrive right now? Or are you a status adjuster, someone who came to the United States some other way and is now admitted as an immigrant? For those people who are status adjusters, there's also a host of information about when they first came to the United States. What visa did they come on? Did they come on a student visa? Did they come on a visa for workers of extraordinary ability? Did they come as a farm worker? Did they come as a refugee, an asylee? Altogether, there are nearly 300 categories of visas, so I can't list them all off, but they're all there in the data set. And so, we're able to tell, when did they come to the United States? How long did it take them from when they first came to the United States to when they were admitted as an immigrant? There's much information about the time in the United States before they were immigrants. Okay. Having said that, the reason why I first got interested in this data set is because these fiscal year data sets were the basis of INS, of Immigration and Naturalization Service, reporting to the government about who has entered the United States. And every year, the INS would create a statistical yearbook that had, it was about this thick, and it had multiple tables of new immigrants, new non-immigrants, refugees, asylees, naturalizations, and so forth. The section on new immigrants that had all those tables of new immigrants comes from these data, okay? The section on non-immigrants comes from a similar data set on non-immigrants. And those individual data have never been made available to the public. What got the data geek in me is that given that this is such a long time series, I could collate all the new immigrants who came, let's use an example, in 1970 as a non-immigrant, and look at what happened to the non-immigrants who came in 1970 by subtracting away the people who became immigrants from those tables in the 1970 yearbook. And then I could investigate what's the difference between non-immigrants who stay and become immigrants and those who leave the United States after their time as a student is up, after their time as an extraordinary worker is up, after their time as a farm laborer is up, and so forth. And so these data are thin in the sense that there's not a huge amount of information available about every person, but they're rich in this historical detail that has never, almost never, been investigated on immigration by immigration researchers.
Thank you, Sherrie. So now I'll just, before we close, I want to open it up to any last remarks from our panelists.
Well, I was just going to say, I think one of the things I hope everybody heard Sherrie say, that she's been emphasizing that these data are designed to be about people who just got their green cards, but you can actually use these data to investigate the people who never got green cards or who hadn't yet gotten green cards, even though we don't have the individual data on them, that it allows you to do that kind of analysis. So for those people who are thinking about people who don't have that kind of the secure status of a green card holder or someone who's naturalized, that they're actually, you can use these to study study who those people were in this period before 2000. And I don't know that Sherrie actually explicitly said this, but the reason that they're available through 2000 and not after is that after September 11th, INS and then, well, Department of Homeland, what became Department of Homeland Security, stopped making these micro data available at all. They still have an immigration yearbook that has the aggregate data, but they don't make the micro data available, the individual level data about individual people available at all. And actually, the one other thing I should say, especially for those of you who might have been listening to the census presentation earlier, is that these data obviously are, they don't have direct identifiers. There are no names or social security numbers or anything like that on the data that INS was making available.
Thank you so much. And with that, we will close this session. Thank you for our participants who stuck with us throughout this whole session. We hope that you learned something. Thank you for your engagement. Thank you to our panelists. A huge thanks, for bringing these data to the world, and we know that their story will continue. So thank you for that. And with that, we just invite you to stick with us throughout the rest of the data fair, which continues through Friday. Sessions are being recorded. There are collaborative notes for each session that you get when you sign up in the links that we send you. And please do post to social media. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Dory, and especially thanks to Andy and Sherrie.
Thanks, everyone. And hopefully we'll figure out some way for people to actually get the information about the data. There are pros and cons. There are some issues with these data, and people should be aware of those issues.
Yeah. So we will be sending the video to all participants. And there's also a link to a sharing site, and we can put information there, especially just the link to the ICPSR collection, so you can find that. But then Sherrie also we can use that document to share with all the participants.
I'll make sure that gets in the notes for this session.
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care. Waiting for my Zoom toolbar to come back here. Hang on. There we go.
Dory,